See, going. All right. Good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we are delighted to have Candace Robb back with us, discussing the brand new Owen Archer novel, A Fox in the Fold. And we were just discussing what a great job they did with the cover of this. Very, very pretty.
Oh, look, wait, Patrick, let me show you the O. Candace, what's the little symbol in it?
That's a fox. And I've been doing, they started it with a crow in the O for a choir of crows.
Mhm.
And so then they put a dragon in the O for the River Woman's dragon. And now I have this stylized fox in it for A Fox in the Fold.
I love it. And in a way, that's really medieval to have animals, in with words. Sorry, Patrick, I interrupted you, but I wanted
That's okay. No. Now, Candace, do you have all these tattooed in various places?
I'm not really into pain, so I don't have tattoos yet.
Well, Candace has signed a batch of books for us, and there we go. I'll go ahead and put a link in the comments field if you'd like to purchase one of our signed books. And if you have questions for Candace, go ahead and type them in, and I'll be monitoring that. And Barbara will bring me back on screen whenever is the appropriate time. So, Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. It's really great to see Candace again. And I just did a little video for Instagram in which I pointed out how much I miss Alice Peters, who was actually a personal friend. And I love the Brother Cadfael books, which she managed to get to 20. Do you remember, Candace, that her goal was to write her way all the way through the war between Matilda and Stephen until Henry II came to the throne, but she didn't quite make it. No, but she did at least write the 20th Brother Cadfael, and she actually left him in a good spot. So.
Oh, she did. It's a that last book is so beautiful.
It really is, yeah. And I've been to visit Shrewsbury, and there's not a lot left of what she was writing about, but there's still that feeling with the way the river bends around Shrewsbury. So there is an English gate and a Welsh gate, and that part is still, I think a lot of the abbey's under the old railroad tracks now or something, but what can I say?
Yeah.
Anyway, moving up to medieval period, we have C.J. Sampson, whose marvelous series, it's really dark and kind of scary series, a mystery version of Hilary Mantel. And then Sharon K. Penman, who wrote about Eleanor of Aquitaine in The Queen's Man, which I thought was a wonderful book. She wrote lots of historical fiction, but historical mystery. But she was earlier. So what you have claimed is the end of the 14th century. Mm-hmm. And I was just reviewing, because anybody who ever read Catherine by Anya Seton, which is like the Bible for figuring out the whole thing, will recall that the Black Prince, the son of Edward II, who lived a really long time for a monarch, Black Prince died at the age of, I think, 46 in his 40s in 1376. And his son, who was only 10, Richard of Bordeaux, became king in June of 1377, something like that, and died in 1399 under what one could say is mysterious circumstances. And that's when the Lancashires came in, and the whole War of the Roses thing really took off. So what Candace is writing about is October 1376. Now, in your earlier books, it has been the Black Prince still alive, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is the first book in which he's died. And now Owen, because Owen has been working in the past 3 books directly for him.
Right.
And now he is working for Princess Joan, for his widow, and for the heir to the throne.
How old is Owen by now? Is he going to live to 1399 when we lose Richard?
No, well, he's still alive in 1399, but the reason why I started the Kate Clifford books in 1399 was because I wanted to cover that period, and I felt that Owen would be probably out on one of his manors by that time and kind of living the good life.
Well, yeah, one could certainly hope so. And then, I mean, I'm trying to remember, Henry IV he lasted till 14, 12 or something along in there. And then we got Henry V and Henry VI and the whole mess.
Yeah, they're a very interesting. I think Henry IV is a really interesting character.
Me too.
The politics at that time are very paranoid, and yeah, so I may go back to that time at some point. But I just love the Owen Archer characters, and in this book it was just so much fun to really give. I really gave Owen a hard time. I dragged him through the coals in this one.
Yes, you did. And there's a nice play. The title, A Fox, has a play on the name of the character in the book. Whose
Right.
nickname is Renard, which is French for fox. So, right. But there's a lot that goes on in this book. There's a romance that disintegrates, not Owen's, because Owen and Lucy are quite happily married.
Yes, they are.
But, so take us through what happens. What is it that starts this off? It's kind of an unusual crime.
Well, it's a really odd crime, and what's interesting about it is I had the idea for this book because I had been reading about carters and how they were the men who were commissioned to move those stones for buildings. For big building projects were often the real problems. The tradesmen who caused all the problems because they would try to delay things so they got more money, and they would complain about this and that. And I just thought, I just have to use this information somewhere. So I started with this Owen being called by the sheriff, which is unusual because he works for the mayor of York, but by the sheriff of Yorkshire, to come out to look at a body that has been found on some property that he tells him is right outside the gate. And so it could be a city problem. But it winds up being quite a ride away from York, and winds up being on the sheriff's property. And that's how he knew about it. But it's this naked man who's lying there, who's been murdered. He has a lot of old wounds on him, old injuries that Owen can see, and he has the body type of an archer, the really strong shoulders, upper part of the body. And Owen just has this little sense that he was an archer at one time. He's an older man, and you just have this feeling. I hope that the reader has the feeling that this is more than it seems. This is more than someone who was just a laborer who was found dead in the field. And of course, he's been murdered. And it all has to do at the beginning with this cart of elaborate stonework that is being brought to the Priory of St. Clement's by William of Wykeham, the Bishop of Winchester, to try to coax back a particular nun back to Werewell Abbey so that he can get in the good graces of the people he needs to be, because he is having political problems. So it all seems to be related to Wykeham, and Wykeham has been a thorn in Owen's side whenever he shows up in his life. And that is actually what I intended when I started writing this book. It was going to all revolve around Wykeham. And at some point as I'm writing, I thought, I need to sit down and have a chat with Owen, because I think there's something very personal going on here. And it winds up all being related to Owen's past as captain of archers for John of Gaunt's father-in-law, Henry of Bromont, who was the former Duke of Lancaster. And so I had fun with Owen being so sure that it was Wykeham, and Wykeham all the way through, of course, because he's this great egotist and it's always about him, is absolutely sure it still is all about him. It's a political ploy because John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, who he has had this long, and this is historical, they just disliked each other, and Gaunt always blamed him for whatever was going wrong. And Gaunt has taken over for the king and for the royal family at this time, because the king is very ill and he's still grieving the death of his son, the Black Prince, who was to be his heir. And so Gaunt has the power, and Wykeham knows that this is trouble for him. So it seems very clear to him that this is all about him, that his carter, is missing, that this cart of stones winds up in York, just left in Toft Green, and the carter's missing, the one of the workers is murdered. And Owen begins to realize it's got really very little to do with Wykeham. He was just like the opportunity for these people to come to York.
Wow, there's really a lot to unpack here. So let me see if I can get along certain lines here. So let's get John of Gaunt out of the way. I'm going to go back to Catherine, my Bible, Catherine by Anya Seton. But basically, John of Gaunt was the second, I think it was, son of Edward.
Well, third son, but right. Lionel died quite early.
Oh, right. Okay. So anyway, Edward III, who all monarchs who lived a really long time, except for the most recent monarch, and we have yet to see whether there will be any complication, but I don't think so, from Elizabeth II's death. But the heir is the heir for a really long time, and sometimes the heir dies before the monarch, which happened with George III. Was the grandson of George II, because his father, I think it was Frederick Augustus, didn't live as long as George II. Anyway, the Duke of Lancaster, really, if you think about it, was remarkably restrained, because when the Black Prince died, this little boy was only 10. And, there's a long history of regents coming in and, either killing the child or taking over from the child or something. But John of Gaunt resisted that. And, it was his son, Henry IV, who actually, in the end, became the first Lancastrian king of the three. So I've always admired John, given the fact that he could have, but what I love, the irony of it all, is that John of Gaunt had this long-term affair with Catherine Swynford, by whom he had children. And eventually, because he was able to have those children legitimized. All children born outside of marriage were bastards and not able to inherit. But John of Gaunt eventually was able to marry Catherine Swynford and get his children legitimized. So eventually they became the Tudors.
Right.
It's a really long way around. And what Candace is writing about is that whole period where John of Gaunt is now the regent. And it's going to go from 1377 all the way to Henry Tudor in, what was it, 1590? Is that when he?
Oh, that's beyond my time. I don't know the
he might have died in 1590. I can't remember exactly where in the 16th century the War of the Roses, or maybe it was the 15th century, came to an end. But it was this huge family dispute, in other words, that went around. So people had to line up royalties, and it was just a guess about who was going to win, who was going to live. It was a really complicated time because power was so personal. But the other thing that's interesting is that this Carter's thing that Candace is talking about, it could be the Teamsters. I mean, this is really, it's really very modern that, the Carters behave much like the Teamsters. The delivery system we're seeing today is not functioning the way that it really ought to. The bishop, who you'd think would be a churchman, is actually more of a politician and happy to be paying bribes. And what he's looking for is to increase his clout by bringing a nun back towards himself. And doing that, he's created this bribe. He wants to deliver this gorgeous stone. And one of the things I've always found interesting, Candace, is that, York is known for the York Minster, right? It's absolutely gorgeous. But for some reason or other, even in a city as small as York, there were a whole bunch of other churches.
Oh, it was a city of churches. Can you imagine what it would have been like to live there in the Middle Ages and hear the bells?
All the time.
all
Yeah.
the time. The bells would, because people would be dying all the time. There would just be bells going off, and at noon, and when there was a service, and yes, it's
So a question arises, why did there need to be a load of stone delivered to build yet another religious institution in the city of York? Although this isn't going to be a city church, this is going to be
no.
for
This is part of the Priory
Yeah.
of Clement, just outside the gates, and it's actually for the orchard wall that abuts the church, and he has been told that it's a very ugly, it's crumbling, and it's a very ugly wall, and it's very embarrassing, and so he has this idea that he will send them this lovely stone to create an archway and a wall, just make this very beautiful, and in exchange he can get Sister Miriam back in Dame Miriam back at Werewell, where she will be the chantress. She's the head of the singers, and
Does she have no say in that? I mean, can she refuse?
oh, she does, yes, and that is part of what happens in the book, is that she has to really think about it, and she prays about it, about which of her choices is actually where she's being called.
Okay. So it wasn't completely, I mean, there was some autonomy, even if she was under the rule in the church. So it could be that the bishop is doing all this for nothing.
Yes, but it's the goodwill gesture that he hopes, the gesture at least. And he also wants to talk to Owen, because he thinks that Owen has a connection with Sir Thomas Parry, who is in the he is one of John of Gaunt's men, and so he has all of these little political reasons for being there, and none of which Owen has time for by the time everything starts exploding and the danger starts moving toward his family.
I was just looking up Henry VII because it annoyed me. I couldn't remember. It was 1490 when I think that when he was able to take over as the first Tudor king under somewhat questionable lineage, and he died in 1509. And his son Arthur created yet another problem, because he died in Ludlow Castle. Right. And we got Henry VIII, who screwed up everything. So, these historical deaths, I was talking to Ian Rankin earlier today. Somehow we got into Mary Queen of Scots because he was quoting a line from Mary Queen of Scots at the beginning of his book. And, I was pointing out that if her husband, her first husband, Francis, hadn't died, she would have stayed the Catholic Queen of France, and probably had children and so forth, and none of what followed for Mary probably would have happened.
Yeah.
So these unfortunate deaths, particularly early deaths of royal personages, really changed history.
Yep, the fickle finger of fate.
It really is, yeah. Anyway, so Owen, if I remember right, had a long-time employer, mentor, whatever you want to call it, in the bishop of, or the archbishop
of York.
Right, who's now dead, right? Because
who died, yeah. He died at the end of A Vigil of Spies, so at the end of the 10th book. And and the new Archbishop of York is a Neville, Alexander Neville, and he is. I have never been able to find a historian or a historical passage that has anything good to say about him.
Really?
And so, he was quite a very self-centered and very uninterested, really, in the city of York, in the Archbishopric. He wanted to get even with people who had tried to stymie his career. And he really has been put in place by his brother, the Baron of Neville, for the power, because it's a great power point in the north, to have the Archbishopric of York under your wings and on your side and fighting for you. But like shortly after this, Alexander has this big battle with the canons of Beverley, and it's this scandal that nobody except young King Richard II, or not Richard II, yes, Richard II. He actually supports him, and he becomes King Richard's man, which is kind of interesting. But at this point, he's still not doing much of anything. So Owen has nothing to do with him.
Well, I mean, the Nevilles are a really interesting family. They took a tremendous role in the War of the Roses.
Oh, yes.
And in fact, Anne Neville was the wife of Richard III. So,
but they're just really building up their power now. They're not nearly as powerful as they are once Henry is king.
Right. But a lot of the power of these families depended, some of it was land-based and all, but a lot of it depended on their relationship with the royals. And the Nevilles, rose to power, particularly under the Yorkist kings. Yeah, no, I have that wrong because it was Richard. No, it was the Yorkist kings.
Yes,
Richard III and so forth. I mean, Shakespeare just loved all this. You can read your way all the way through. In fact, he has a great play called Richard II, which I've always loved because it has a great court scene. A legal thriller. It is a legal thriller, but the court scene is actually the way things were early decided. It's a combat scene rather than a judicial courtroom, and that I think that's it explains a lot about how the judicial system works if you ever watch Richard II.
Yeah, but I think what I'm more interested in is the judicial system for the more common folk, and that was so interesting because it was much more geared toward what is for the benefit of the community, and I really like that, and I think I have tried in the Owen Archers to make that clear that there are often odd decisions that the people in power will make relative to how we would resolve some of these issues. Some of the things that happened at the end of this book, the people who are given their freedom, even though they had caused trouble in the city, it's because it's for the benefit of the community that this is how we resolve this. And we got the people who were really behind all the problems. And I think that's so interesting. It wasn't as true for the nobility, but it really is true for the common man. And that is, it's quite different from our idea of a justice system. The jury were people who would have some knowledge of the person who was accused, sometimes even members of their family, which would never happen in our judicial system. So I think that's really interesting.
I thought you did that very well in your last book with the River Woman, because they were scapegoats, there are always going to be scapegoats, but this is before the religious wars. This is before Henry VIII and Protestantism. So there was kind of a common Catholic framework. And that was some glue that held society together. The guild system was still in operation, although it had been weakened by the plague years earlier.
Oh no, actually the guild system gets more powerful.
Sorry, it was the peasant, the serf system is what got weakened by the Black Death, because there just weren't enough workers to go around. Another curiously modern note that we have seen today in the Great Resignation. But I'm sorry, the guild system did, as a consequence, grow.
It becomes much more powerful, and actually it's the guild system in the early 15th century. So that, a little beyond what I'm writing with Owen, is very powerful in the city. Right. And of course, that's when the mystery plays get more and more elaborate.
Yeah, but they're, they had their own disciplines and their own structure. And so, you had the church that was disciplining, you had the guilds that were, disciplinary and structured and so forth. So there was a lot that the nobility didn't have any attention to that, but there was a lot that held the rest of society together. So Lucy is an interesting character. She was a widow, right? When she first met Owen. And she is a businesswoman in her own right, because she's a very skilled apothecary. And that was one of those careers that was actually open to women if they weren't accused of witchcraft and burned or whatever it is.
Oh, right. Yes.
Which was a danger. That was a real danger, that if you were a woman who knew too much or was suspected of having too much power or whatever, witchcraft was an accusation that was really hard to beat.
Yeah. Yeah. But Lucy is very well respected in the city. And she is actually a member of the guild, even though she can't, there are things that the women in a guild cannot do, that the men do. But she's very, very well respected, and she's having problems with her son, who is her apprentice in this book, because he gets drunk for the first time. And he really causes some problems. And he's having his own problems with Allison. And then because of that, he's causing problems at home. And I one of the things that I wanted to show in this book, and I kind of start out talking about it, is how Owen finds that none of what he has done in his past as captain of archers, as captain of the city, as steward of the archbishop, none of this has been as difficult as being a father. And he really respects all fathers, because it is just so difficult to see his daughter Gwen being so down about her older brother's meanness toward her, because he thinks that she betrayed him when she didn't, and what to do about that.
Yeah.
And he gives Jasper a test. He allows Jasper to prove himself in this book in such a difficult way that I really debated, should I do this? Should I do this? Because it really puts his life in danger. But I thought, this is the real test of him trusting his son and allowing his son to make amends for something that he did, which could have been quite a disaster, quite a tragedy. And I sat down several times with Owen in the writing of this book, not only to get his idea about where we go next, but to apologize to him for everything I was piling on him, because he has problems with Wykeham, he's got problems with the city, he's got problems with his family, and then his family is in very serious danger, and there are casualties in this book, in his family. And he has a difficult time in it, but it's a catharsis for him as well.
Well, there are certainly emotional casualties, and Jasper has had a long romance with Allison. And, it's one of those, people married so young then, but young people don't necessarily know who they are or what they want. And divorce was not an option. So if you acted in haste or or you didn't really know yourself, you could make a terrible mistake. I like the way Lucy at the very end wishes, that her daughter could be as happy in her marriage as she has been. And I mean, she and Owen were not necessarily a likely couple when they met. But tell me the difference between Magda and Lucy, because Magda has a big influence on Allison. So what's the difference between Magda the healer and Lucy the apothecary?
In what sense? I mean, Magda is a healer who is sort of outside the pale. She does not consider herself a Christian. She mostly focuses on taking care of the poor and those who would not be cared for, don't have the money to be cared for by the physicians and the midwives in the city who do it for money. And she's often bartering her services and accepting all sorts of things. I mean, a dog is given to her in this book that Allison then takes on by somebody, and she often just is given jugs of food and things like that in exchange. But she is a healer, a hands-on healer, and Lucy really is a businesswoman. I mean, she runs an apothecary. She has to order from all over the place. You know, apothecaries carried an amazing amount of stuff, and I've actually been thinking about how to get more of their products in the stories because they used a lot, for instance, of beeswax in the mixtures to thicken mixtures and so a lot of apothecaries had a side candle business. Apothecaries, the one that I've been playing with most recently is the apothecaries mixed paints a lot, and I'm trying to finagle that into a story somehow, and you know, with her mixing paint, and I don't know what's going to happen with that, but it could be something very funny since Gwen is now going to be, you know, a sort of child apprentice learning the business by her mother's side. But she is a businesswoman, and she makes money. I mean, she has to make the money in order to, you know, order all these provisions, and people just line up at the shop whenever there is something, you know, going around the city that they're terrified about. In the last book, you saw, you know, everybody's plague theories and plague ideas of what could heal them. So she is very much a part of the city and a businesswoman, and she's not really a hands-on healer.
Right.
I mean, she would normally, you know some things simply because of what she's studied, but she's not a healer.
No, I think of her more as a pharmacist, you know, I mean, a person who has, you know, various things, well, there were lots of drugs that were made from natural products and so forth. So a person who could dispense things.
Mm-hmm.
But Magda struck me was, as you say, hands-on. I mean, she could,
Right.
you know, deliver babies or bandage wounds or, you know, deal with all of that. And as you say, also operated more outside the city because, you know, we see Allison really, you know, interested in following Magda sort of out into the, you know, there was a tremendous rural area. I mean, York was, for the time, it was a big city and a prosperous city, but most people still lived on the land and weren't able to come in for medical care or whatever it all is. So Gwen is really more like her mother, but Allison is more like Magda, and that plays a role in how all these relationships are playing out, right?
It does. And you know, Allison has studied with Lucy because Lucy in a way is more like, I mean, at one point my sister, who's a pharmacist, Jackie, was also, I mean, she was really a consulting pharmacist with IVs in a cancer, the cancer side of a hospital. And so Lucy has that knowledge. She's not just dispensing behind a counter, you know, what somebody else has prescribed, but she is prescribing. She has that knowledge. So Allison has learned a lot from her, but that's not, you know, she has to tell Jasper, you know, his dream of them working side by side in the shop is not her dream, because she wants to do what Magda does and go out and hands-on healing and travel in the countryside and find the people who need her.
women did travel. I mean, their pilgrimage was a very important, activity that people did in the Middle Ages. They covered surprising distances. I mean, few of them went all the way to the Holy Land. Few of the women did. Eleanor of Aquitaine did while pregnant, which I've always thought good for her. But there were women who went on pilgrimages. There were women who, were objects of pilgrimage. Like, was it Julian of Norwich? Wasn't she one?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And so women had more mobility than you might think. In fact, in some cases, men were more tied to the land because, they were farming it and so forth in many instances than women were, which I thought was an interesting thought.
Yeah, well, the women were usually farming beside their husbands. So.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't so much that they, I think it was the unmarried women or the women who had survived marriage and childbirth. I'm trying to remember the diaries of, is it Marjorie of Kemp who kept those wonderful diaries, all of her travels? But
well, they weren't diaries. She actually dictated her life to.
Was that it?
Yeah.
Memoir kind of a thing? Yeah, but I mean, wasn't she a widow? Hadn't she had,
No, actually, when she goes off, she's not a widow.
She's still a wife?
She has agreed with her husband that she's going to do this. And she sort of takes care of his debts. She is a very prosperous businesswoman. And she sort of helps her husband and makes sure everything is all right, and then goes off on pilgrimage. Yeah. And it's mostly, the women who went on pilgrimage were mostly from the merchant class. They weren't farmers. They had the wherewithal, because it actually was rather costly to stay in inns and pay for guides, and sometimes you had to buy your way into a group of pilgrims who were moving to
for protection or for accommodation. I mean, Chaucer is writing the Canterbury Tales in this period. He was actually the brother-in-law of I'm trying to remember which monarch was it.
He is the brother-in-law of John of Gaunt's.
Right.
There's Catherine.
Yep, that's it. I know. I mean, this whole thing, so but Chaucer was he was a civil servant, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. He was. And it's we're moving into the time where he was very well respected in Edward III's court, and he was always busy. But once we get to Richard II's court, he isn't quite so much in favor. And that's when he goes off into the Kent countryside and writes his Canterbury Tales. Paul Strom has a wonderful book. I interviewed him about it when it came out, about what's going on in Chaucer's life and in London when he goes off and writes the Canterbury Tales. And his theory is that Chaucer had gotten used to this court crowd that listened to his poetry. Mm-hmm. And he creates this crowd for himself when he goes out into the country. It's a wonderful theory. I love the idea, because that fits with the Chaucer that I pops into my Owen Archers every once in a while.
So am I mistaken in thinking that Alice Pearce plays some role in your work? She was Edward III.
Oh, yes. Well, I wrote a book about it.
Being a mistress was an official position in a way, I mean, it wasn't like she was just, there to visit the king from time to time. Royal mistresses had households, they had power, they had money, and they also had the king's ear. Well, and more than the king's ear, actually, but still the king's ear.
She actually is the person one of the people who has told Wykeham that Owen might help him. And he delivers a letter to Owen from Alice,
right,
about his situation.
I think she's an amazing woman. I'm trying to remember, somebody wrote a very interesting biography of Alice, but there weren't that many paths to power for women. And Alice, I thought, was a person who really understood how things worked.
Well, as Emma Campion, I wrote the book The King's Mistress, and that's all about Alice.
Okay, maybe that's the one I remember, but I think she's a fascinating
Oh, I
character.
do
And,
too.
um, and it's pretty clear that Edward III in his last years probably suffered, well, became physically more feeble, but mentally he probably wasn't firing on all cylinders either. So Alice would have had unusual power.
Right. And that's also the reason why at this point Lancaster is in charge of the royal family.
Yeah.
And Wykeham has gotten word that the family is meeting to take really everything away from Wykeham, all of the prebends that he has, all of the money that he makes outside of Bishop of Winchester. And he has powerful political enemies, so this is going to make him very vulnerable, and that's behind his whole kind of pilgrimage to York, with the with the cover that he's bringing these stones to the Priory and these sisters to the Priory.
Well, Winchester was a very powerful bishopric.
It was.
York, Winchester, Canterbury were all, there were lesser churches and lesser bishoprics, but Winchester was a real power player. So, there was always some tension between Winchester and York, wasn't there? Isn't there something still about the two of them at the coronation? I'm trying to remember, but the bishop.
No, that's actually the Canterbury and York, because they both have they both have power, and they're the two archbishoprics. And Canterbury is number one in the country.
Right.
York is number two. But there has always been some argument about which one, should be, prevalent at a crowning. So yeah, it's Canterbury and York have always been in competition.
I, for some reason, thought that Canterbury was actually the person doing the crowning, in charge of the ceremony, and York and Winchester were kind of like the supporting bishops, but maybe I have them wrong. My favorite bishopric in all of England is actually Durham. I think that Durham Cathedral is gorgeous, and they wear purple because it's the only Palatinate, I think, bishopric or cathedral in England, and it's tied to Anne Cleeve's new book. Takes you out to the Holy Island in St. Cuthbert, and that's
really?
tied.
Yeah, really? Is that a Vera or is it?
It's a Vera. It's called The Rising Tide, and basically it's one of those kind of Agatha Christie settings because you can only get out to the island when the
right. Then you're stuck.
Yep. So it has that kind of, it's not really a locked room mystery, and people confuse that with a country house murder scenario, but basically it is a country house murder scenario. And and Durham, I think, has a beautiful site. I mean, I love York Minster, and I think it's absolutely gorgeous. Durham has a remarkable site, and one of the reasons I love it is you can go up on the roof.
Cliff.
You can climb up on the roof and you can look out over the countryside, and it's amazing.
You can do that with York too.
Yeah, I know, but somehow Durham is friendlier, smaller. York is so incredibly grand. I mean, it is truly one of the jewels of Gothic architecture. It is so stunning. And when I was there the last time, which was a long, long time ago, the rose window, had been destroyed in the fire, because I was there in the middle 80s and they were building or trying to restore the rose window. And before I went, I did some research, because York still has many of its medieval features. Even they've unearthed some Viking features. The city walls are kind of still extant. And there was, at that time, I don't know if it's still there, but there was a small hotel in the Bootham Bar Gate, which is adjacent to York Minster. And the thing, I did stay there. And the reason I did was that the literature said that if you stayed at the top on the third floor of the Bootham Bar I can't remember if it was called a hotel or what it was. You could, when the bells from the minster would ring, you could almost imagine that you were back in a medieval time, because there wasn't much city noise, and the light would be kind of magical, and the bells would ring, and the whole thing was terrific. The problem with it was, as it all turned out, is how to get there was almost impossible to find out in the road system of York. You had to,
Oh,
I
yes.
ended up having a policeman actually take me to the hotel because I couldn't find it. And there was no lift, so you had to drag your suitcases and everything up, whatever you were doing. But it was true. It was really true that it was just a remarkable experience. And of course, because it was right by the minster, you could spend a remarkable amount of time. And I think York Minster deserves days, not just a hit, but serious visiting.
It does. It does. And it's my late great friend Richard Shepherd, who had been headmaster of the school, of the Minster School, and he was also head of the choir at one point, the choir master. He took me into all sorts of nooks and crannies of the cathedral that no one gets to see, and just looking at the vestments. There are vestments that they have that I think it was at the beginning of the 20th century. There was an archbishop who had an absolute fascination, or maybe it might have been the dean, who had an absolute fascination with Japanese kimono silk and these exquisite. And so you have these truly amazing vestments that look like Japanese vestments, for the church. It's just all sorts of wonderful things like that, are there in the minster to look at. And it's quite an amazing.
I'm an addict of cathedral, the treasure house, the treasuries and cathedrals. It's usually where the great vestments are kept, and the important vessels of the church and the riches of the church and all the rest of it. And York certainly has. The Tower of London is good, but honestly, I think that the treasury at York Minster might even be better. Well,
I certainly think so, but that's me.
Yeah, well, I like it too. One of the reasons I love Owen, I suppose, is because I've spent a lot of time in York. It's familiar, and I can see it. And there still are some of those little crooked winds, the little alleys and streets, and you can walk partway around. At least you could 40 years ago. You could walk around the medieval walls to a great extent, not entirely, but it's just it's maybe because it's so far north. It was protected from a lot of things. It wasn't in the heat of the action down south.
It had its peak in the 15th century, and then it sort of went downhill for a long time, and then it was built up by the chocolate manufacturers and the railway in the Victorian period. So what you've got in York is you've got medieval and Victorian, and now you've got 21st century stuff.
And Viking too.
And Viking, but you don't, there isn't a lot.
No, I know, but it's there. It's just
but it's there underneath. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
It's really.
Well, you're in a wonderful, you're in the right century and the right place to be writing this series. So what do you plan for? I'm hoping that you're continuing the story of Owen.
Oh, absolutely. No, I'm not finished with him. No. Like Ellis Peters was after a certain period of time. I have to at least get past the Peasants' Revolt. So that's 1381. So, and I'm only in 1376, and I can always slow down a little bit. So I'm going to keep going.
Well, the great thing about writing historical fiction is that it's not outdated.
Well, that's true.
It already is. So, you can slow things down, and nobody's saying, why isn't Harry Bosch getting a year older? Because, they're older and dead. So you can proceed at a very, very leisurely pace in writing historical fiction to examine things. I think it'd be wonderful if you go all the way to 1399, but that would be an awful lot more books, wouldn't it?
That would be a lot of books. Yes. But who knows? Who knows? Eternally young.
Do you have any interest in reviving your other series?
At the moment, I'm not thinking about them, but I sort of left Kate Clifford in kind of an interesting place, and I have a lot of people writing to me and asking for more of those. So you never know.
No, I thought she was a really interesting character. And
Yeah,
liked
I
that
love her.
name as well. So is there anything else you'd like to say about A Fox in the Fold? We've been wandering all over.
Yeah, we've been wandering all over, but I think the important thing about the book is that Owen has to finally really come face to face, literally, with the big event that changed his life, with the night of when he was partially blinded. And I didn't realize that was where I was going till I got about halfway through the book. And then when I went back, I realized that there's this scene at the beginning in which Gwen is telling Reese, this young stone worker who's working on their house, about how her father lost the sight in that eye.
Mm-hmm.
And I must have known that's what the book was about from the very beginning. And so Reynard is a very important character in Owen's past, and not somebody that he particularly wanted to
Meet again.
see again. And I think it's one of my more powerful books. I really love this book, and I love how Owen comes through it. I love the things that he has to go through, the personal changes and the personal changes he has to acknowledge and finally really accept in this book.
I think the thing is when you start a series, even if you didn't know it was a series, but let's say when you wrote the first Owen Archer, which I can remember because I've read you in real time, all the way through all this, you had to pick, he was a certain age and he had certain experience and whatever. And, the things that happened to him in the past, at least in a first novel, oftentimes are not that important because, you're moving forward, trying to figure things out. But I think it's, if you write a really long-term series, you really want to get to grips with the whole arc of the character. And I have found that most people who write long-term series, in one way or another, do go back and write about that time before we first met. Whether it's an actual prequel or whether, I'm trying to think of his name, but I'm having a mental blank here. But anyway, one of my favorite authors, a Victorian, Charlie, whose name is, I keep wanting to say Charlie Lovett, but that's not it. Was so engaged in writing a prequel, he wrote a prequel trilogy because he had so much more to say.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. Thank you, Patrick. Charlie Finch, right? Charles Finch. And Charles Lennox is the name. Now it's all coming back to me, the name of the character. But it isn't just about Charles Finch, but also the woman that he's married to. And it's so interesting to see them knowing what will happen to them, but it hasn't happened yet, and they're working along. And I don't remember anybody else writing a prequel trilogy, so to speak, but many, many authors have either written a prequel or they find ways to bring in a cold case or something that creates an opportunity, to go back and write that earlier life. And so I think your subconscious here was at work.
Yes. Oh, yes. And, I realized, I've never really explained how that happened.
Exactly.
How somebody got into the camp that night. Who was the traitor? And so.
Yeah, but by writing a present threat, you gave yourself an opportunity to go back and tell us about Owen before we met him.
Right.
And so this is, in a way, it's a prequel of a sort. Lucy has talked about her past, even though we haven't read it. Yep, The Apothecary Rose. What year did you write that? I mean, I remember reading it.
That came out in 93.
Okay. And I started the store in 1989. So as I say, I've been able to read Candace in real time, which I have very much enjoyed. I also was able to read the Brother Cadvilles in real time because I think Edith published it at the end of the, if I remember right, at the end of the 80s.
Yeah.
I don't know if you recall, I'll wind up with this, but genre fiction, or not genre, but fiction tends to have cycles where, people are really interested in one thing and then it gets oversaturated and it dies down and something new comes. Right now we're having the rise of the Gothic, for example, which has been out of practice or out of interest for a long time, but it's coming back. So in the 1980s, historical fiction was way down. I mean,
Yeah, it was.
all those big historical novels that we think about, Catherine Forever Amber, Samuel Shellabarger, all those guys, it wasn't in fashion. And so people who loved writing historical fiction moved into historical mystery because,
I was pushed by an agent into, well, you need to do this if you want to write about the Middle Ages. And I said, oh, fine. I mean, it was before I'd ever read a Cadfill, but it was, I thought, oh, I can do that. And I thought that's great.
And so in the 90s, there was a huge surge of historical mystery. The name of the rose
came out.
The name of the
Sharon
rose
Newman
was
came out right
instrumental
before
in,
me.
sorry?
Sharon Newman came out right before me. I mean, her Death Comes as Epiphany was the summer before my book came out.
Yeah, a wonderful series. I was sorry that she didn't write more of it. But Umberto Eco and Ellis Peters together wrote these very powerful, very popular books. And it was like a funnel, that sucked people up into historical mystery. And today, there are very few people writing. There was a while where there was a lot of historical mystery, and now it's coming back, but it's not mostly medieval.
Right.
And in fact, the 20th century has now become historical fiction. The 1930s are huge at the moment, possibly because we're living through them again, which is, a depressing thought.
It is.
Yep. But I've always thought that medieval period really lent itself to mystery. It just, the way things work, the society, culture, everything else really lends itself, I think, to the mystery novel in a way.
Oh, I think so.
Yeah. And I mean, in a way that 18th century doesn't so much for me, and oddly enough, very few people have ever written 17th century mystery. I mean, the Jacobean period has never been a very fertile ground for crime fiction. So, go figure. On the other hand, there was Roman mystery running out your ears and almost nothing about ancient Greek. There were tons of Egyptian mystery. There was one about Babylon. So, some of it, I think, is driven by what people are familiar with, and more people are familiar with Rome and Egypt than they were with Babylonia, or, you don't see much in the way of South American historical fiction. Mayan or Peruvian mystery is fairly rare. So it's a combination, I think, of the marketplace and also what interests authors. But, I'm a huge fan of historical mystery, but to me, the medieval period is still the best one for it.
Oh, I'm glad you think that.
Thank you. Indeed. Patrick, come and talk to us about whatever anybody might want to say. I've been obviously tired and my memory hasn't been working all that well. So thank you. It's made me a little spacey here.
Let's see here. I think it's probably data overload. You're having a hard time accessing those files.
You're right. The retrieval system is what, people think that older people lose their memories, but that's not really it. It's your retrieval system is so overburdened. It just takes it longer to get to where you want to go.
I'm trying to remember who the author is who had this wonderful line that it's not that her memory is bad now, it's that her memory, she's always seen her memory for words as this, as her servant who is very distinguished, and he comes and he brings it on a silver tray. And he's aging as well as she is. So his steps are much slower. And he comes much more slowly to her chair than he did in the past. And I just love that excuse for why words were slipping.
Well, fortunately, Patrick goes very quickly with his silver salver to deliver whatever it is I get.
Yeah.
He's so used to me by now, he could tell what I can't think of it.
Let's see, as far as questions go, yeah, I mean, there's some questions about your research methods, which you've touched upon a little bit. Do you stick primarily to books, or how do you go about it?
I poke the brains of a lot of historians, and follow a lot of people on Twitter, and then get to know them, and because books go so far, and then if you can talk to the people who wrote them, you can dig into all the material that they couldn't get into the books. And of course, I go to York as often as I can, and work in the archives there. So it's a combination of many different things.
Let's see here. Are you struck by, when you're researching historical characters, sometimes just how contemporary they seem?
Oh,
And,
yes.
the people, our basic motivations don't change, and
Right.
yeah.
And I often, there will be a character. I was talking about Archbishop Neville, and he reminds me of a certain ex-president in many ways, and things that he does, and you just go, wow, they were all there. They're just changing form.
Let's see. Okay. Yeah, Claire would like to know, will any of your recent books be recorded for audio?
Oh, I would love that. I've been trying to get them in audio, but it's just it's up to my agent. I keep nagging her about it. We just talked about it last week. So I hope so.
All right, the inevitable TV question. Who would you cast as Owen Archer?
Oh, I keep changing my mind about that. But now I'm going to forget his name. The one who played Poldark is someone I think would oh shoot. I've completely lost his
Oh, you
name.
mean the new Poldark?
The new Poldark.
Yeah. I love the old Poldark.
I think he was pretty good.
Look it up for you while you're thinking.
Yeah, I change my mind all the time.
I'm looking him up too.
Oh, gee, it's on the tip of my tongue, but
He's an Irish guy. Is it Aidan Turner?
yes.
Yep.
Yep, Aidan Turner.
Mhm.
Yep.
Right.
He, yeah, I think that he would make a very nice Owen Archer.
Let's see. I think, well, people are happy. You have some, well, by the way, you do have viewers from all over the world tuning in. We have some people from Australia.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, and they're very happy to hear that there's more Owen Archer to come. Let's see what else we've got.
While you're looking, I have a question which I haven't thought to ask Candace, which is, why York? What was it that, because you could have written about anything before you started. What was it about York that piqued your interest so?
It's all there. I mean, you walk into the city of York, and you're in the Middle Ages. I am in the Middle Ages. I mean, everything kind of disappears except the medieval part of York. And when I first went there back in the 70s, that really ages me. I looked around for books, novels that were set in York, and there weren't many. So I thought, oh, well, if I'm ever going to do something, York is where I'm going to do it. And it was so full of, it had the Archbishop, it had guilds, it had the wealth, it had the river going through it. I could just really picture things happening on the river, which I use the river a lot in this book, probably more than I've used it in other books. And I just, it just seemed like the perfect setup for a historical novel. I didn't realize at the time that I was going to turn it into a crime novel, but even more perfect when I got
So it was visiting York that sparked.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Absolutely.
And you're right, it does. Well, I've said this earlier that I think that the medieval period really lends itself to mystery. But the other thing is, if you want to write a book and you're new at it, mystery has a structure. Mystery has a skeleton that you can hang a story on, and it often attracts people for that reason. And they didn't necessarily start out to be a mystery writer, but it just turned out that writing one, structurally, what made sense.
Yeah, it's like writing a sonnet. It has a structure that you need, but within it, you can do whatever you like.
And as Ian Rankin pointed out earlier today, in case any of you want to watch it, the mystery novel really explores huge themes. I mean, it can talk, social change, justice, ethical questions of all kinds. And I remember P.D. James saying that years and years ago when she was at the Poison Pen. Gosh, I think it was 1995. And somebody actually, towards the end, I've never gotten over this, asked her when she was going to write a real book.
Oh my God.
And there was this sort of collective gasp,
Oh,
and then she really reamed him out and basically said what I'm just saying, that, the mystery novel allows her to explore, all these wonderful ethical, moral, human questions and, concepts of justice and all the rest of it. She really flattened him.
Absolutely. Oh, humanity. I mean, here it is in crime novels. I mean, it's just here. And in a way, they're the modern morality plays.
Yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely true. In fact, people still put on mystery plays here and there, which I think are,
In York.
in
Every other
Europe especially, which are, there to kind of remind us concepts like, justice or sin and retribution and so forth, really show up. We should have one of those. We should have Congress put on a mystery play. Everybody would.
Well, that would be a wild one with this.
No,
Aren't they already doing that though?
Oh,
I think they are. Yeah.
Candace, have you ever given any thought to writing a contemporary mystery novel? And if you did, what would it?
Yeah, I keep trying to write a haunted house mystery. I have this, my sister Jen will remember this house that we took pictures of. We scared ourselves silly walking down the lane to it in Appalachia years and years ago. And I've always wanted to write a haunted house story about this house. And it just never, I always my mind goes wandering off back to the Middle Ages. I don't know what it is. It's like, it's cursed.
Well, we're very fortunate that it turned out that way, because otherwise we wouldn't have this wonderful body of work. And these books are very, very dear to my heart. And if you've not read one, you can actually plunge in with A Fox in the Fold. And I'll remind you, we have autographed copies. Or I'm trying to remember, Candace, are there earlier books? Actually, I haven't looked for a long time. Are they still available?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Diversion puts out the first 10.
Right. So I would go back and start with my focus is always on the new stuff. I do ordering for the store, but oftentimes I truly lose track of what we've got other than the new novel. But I would go all the way back to the Apothecary Rose then, if you're new to this, and read your way forward. Because although the mysteries are complete in every book, there's a lot, the characters change and you learn about them and so forth. And there are always inevitably character spoilers in a long series. If
That's true.
I remember those first covers were Apothecary Rose and Lady Chapel, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those were St. Martin's Press, weren't they?
The original, yeah.
Yeah.
And then you were published by Mysterious Press for quite
for a couple of books. Yeah.
Just a couple, okay.
Yeah, and Sarah died. Sarah Ann Freed died.
Right.
And yeah, good friend of yours, Barbara, wasn't
She's a very dear friend. It just absolutely broke my heart. One of the great decisions and one of the hardest ones at the time that I almost ever made in terms of book selling was I was devoted to Elizabeth Peters. I mean, I loved the Amelia Peabody books, and we were friends and we knew each other really well. And for years, I had said to her publisher that I thought they ought to give her a publication party at the Temple of Dender at the Metropolitan Museum before she got too old to do it. All right.
Yeah.
So I was in New York in February with Sarah Ann doing something, I can't remember what. And she told me she was ill. And we made plans to go to see a big production at the Metropolitan Opera. I would go back to New York in May and do that together in case she was really ill.
Mhm.
And I went home and there was an invitation from HarperCollins on the very same night to go to the Temple of Dender for Elizabeth Peters' publication party. And, I mean, I just could hardly believe that this had happened. And in the end, I went with Sarah and she was my friend. And I thought, I'll never forgive myself if something happens to her. And I threw her over in order to go to Elizabeth Peters'
Right.
publication party. And
She died in June, wasn't it?
she died. Rob and I were in Canada at, I'm trying to remember whether it was the Toronto BoucherCon or Book Expo, but Suzanne Kirk, who was the editor of Scribner, was our other very good friend. And I still remember her calling me early in the morning to tell me that Sarah Ann had died. And I had spoken to Sarah Ann a couple of nights before. She had an illness that made her really vulnerable to her immune system, was completely shot. And I've never understood this. The hospital that she was in New York allowed her unlimited visitors and people would come in and sit on her bed. And, there she was. It was some kind of blood disease. I can't remember, some form of leukemia or something.
It was a form of leukemia.
But she was a really sturdy person. And I've
She
always
was.
thought, I expected her to beat it. We all expected her to do okay. And I really think that very lax system at that hospital, that somebody, it's kind of like a version of COVID or something, but I think somebody brought in something with that visitor policy and it just killed her because she almost died overnight. I mean, it was really that fast.
I know it was very fast.
Yeah. But anyway, that's one of those things that you look back and you think, okay, I made the right choice. It was really painful. It was truly painful. But I'm in the end, if you love somebody, you have to make the tough decision.
Yeah.
So
She was an easy person to love.
Is Ira still around?
I don't know, Patrick. He eventually remarried, and Sarah Ann was only in her 50s when she died. She was a long time ago.
Remember that great house they had on Van Dam?
Yeah. And here's an example. I'm wandering off here, and we'll end this. But Sarah Ann had a really big, very kind heart, and she would have parties. They had this fabulous house down in Soho. And Sarah Ann always had book parties at her own home. And finally, one day I remember saying to her, Sarah, this is such an incredible amount of work. And why are you doing this? And she said, these poor girls who work in the company and publicity and other stuff, she said, they often don't make enough money to eat. They, to pay New York rents and so forth. She said, so if I have the parties, they can take all the food home. I was the kind of person she was, just amazing. So I miss her still. I think about her, all the time. And I think about Elizabeth Peters too, whom I absolutely loved and was a great historical fiction writer in a different era. So on that note, I don't want to talk about you. I want us to have more conversations, Candace. I have to talk about making tough choices. So
you look healthy, Candace.
I am.
Indeed so. It's wonderful to talk to somebody that knew somebody that that you loved and who missed them too. You don't get those chances all that often. So thank you for bringing it up. Anyway, thank you all for joining us this evening, and we'll be either talking to Candace in person or virtually with her next book, whenever that happens to be. Good night, everybody.
Night.
Good night.